Good afternoon. Oh, sure, I'll do that. I'm good. Good afternoon. We'll start the presentation in about 30 seconds. So. Good afternoon. For the record, my name is Michael Kane. I'm the Legislative Budget Assistant. In front of me are the Legislative Budget Assistant staff. We have Mick Landrigan, Melissa Rollins. Sure. In front of me, we have the LBA staff. We have Mick Landrigan, Melissa Rollins, Jack Mullen, Kevin Ripple, and behind us is Chris Shea handing out some documents if anyone needs any. So before we're going to give the LBA kind of overview of the Senate changes to the House passed budget. Before you have a document which is also posted online. I'm just going to walk you through kind of the process that Senate Finance used as they went through the budget. So as with the House, revenues are a big part of making budget decisions. So the Senate Ways and Means Committee worked they had to wait for April revenues to come in before they made any final decisions, but worked for the first couple weeks on trying to determine where the Senate revenues would end up compared to the House. They had a vote in the Senate Ways and Means Committee prior to the final revenues in April, and then came back again once they had those final figures and had discussions with the chair came into Senate Finance, Senator Lang, and had discussions with Commissioner Stepp on the business taxes, real estate transfer, and tobacco. And so you ended up having an increase in taxes over what the House had assumed. When we look at the total revenue, the base revenue in general and education trust funds, Senate revenues were about $416 million over the 3 years, 25, 26, and 27, over where the House was. When you add in the adjustments, one of the largest adjustments being the revenue splits between the funds of education and general fund and also the VLT revenue. Revenues over the 3 years between the House and Senate proposed budget is about $237 million. That's in total. One of the big reasons is because of the differences in the VLT, the video lottery terminal revenue estimates that the Senate had assumed, which were almost about 80 million plus below what the House had. If you go to page 1, is a surplus statement summary of General and Education Trust Fund, of where the House had proposed and what the Senate proposed. We did, for comparative purposes, we did include restricted lottery funds. As you remember, the House restricted all lottery revenue for adequate education grants. And so to provide an apples-to-apples comparison, we did include that under the House column for Education Trust Fund. So in total for 25, just to walk you through there, $210 million is the amount of money that came forward in the General and Education Trust Fund from fiscal year 24, which closed this past June. In total revenues, you can see the House combined revenues with adjustments of almost $3.3 billion, $3.019 billion, and compared to the Senate of about $3,080,000. So you have almost a $60,000 increase in base revenues, General and Education Trust Fund after adjustments, just for 25. For appropriations, the House had assumed $3.3 billion of General and Education Trust Fund appropriations. This includes all the appropriations that have passed in 2023, 2024, any off-budget appropriations like legal settlements and lapse estimates. So the House came in with total appropriations about $3.3 billion. The Senate, you can see, came in a little under at about $3.278 billion. One reason for that I'll get to in the surplus statement is because of the lapse estimate. The HHS lapse estimate at the time of the governor and the House budget were prepared, HHS was assuming about a $22 million lapse. In May, HHS provided information to the HHS Oversight Committee that they actually think their 25 lapse is going to be about closer to over $60 million. And so that allowed the Senate to increase their lapse estimate to adjust for that $38 million of additional lapse that HHS had provided. Cumulative ending balance for 25 in the House was a negative 76.967 compared to about 12 billion in the Senate proposed budget. Transfer from the rainy day fund, because the general fund would end up in a deficit at the end of 25. The House had assumed about 148.8 based on their revenue estimates. With the change in the revenue estimates and with the change to the lapse estimate, the Senate transfer from the rainy day fund is about $93.4 million. And this is all dependent on where the revenues and the appropriation lapses end up over the next few weeks to close the fiscal year. So the balance after the transfers is really the education trust fund balances. House had about $71.8 million of education trust fund balance, which will be available in 26. The Senate at 105.5. The rainy day fund balances currently in 24, estimate of 292.5. The House in 25 would bring that down to 143.7 based on their estimates at the time. The Senate has the 292 dropping down to about 199 at the end of 25 based on their revenue estimates and the appropriations. So going into 26, the only balance forward from the House and the Senate, the education trust fund balance. For the House, again, the 71.8. Add to that about $3.047 billion in revenue, combined general and education trust fund. Total appropriations of about $3.091, resulting in a cumulative ending balance after accounting for the beginning balance carry forward of about $28.4 million under the House proposal. Of that $28.4 million in the mid-year for 26-27, 13.787 was general fund share, 14.644 was the education trust fund share. No change to the rainy day fund balance because the rainy day fund only receives any surplus at the end of a biennium, so that would be 27 coming up. Under the Senate proposal, they have a higher education trust fund balance to begin 26 based on their revenues of 105.5. In addition, their total revenues, general and education trust fund, came in at about $3.118 billion for 26. So you can see almost a $71 million increase in your revenues, offset by appropriations of about $3.2 billion, leaving a cumulative ending balance between general and education trust fund at the end of 26 at about $23.9 million, closer to $24 million. Now, how that splits out in the general fund and education trust funds, the general fund actually has a negative balance at the end of 26, which is then carried forward into 27. Education trust fund at about $43.5 million. So from an education trust fund balance, you're almost $28 million up in the Senate proposal versus the House proposal going into 27. When we begin 27, the House had about 28.4 from both funds coming forward. Estimated revenue and adjustments at $3.157 billion, offset by appropriations of about $3.1 billion, resulting in a cumulative ending balance of a positive $85 million, which allowed the House to transfer $85 million into the rainy day fund, bringing the 143.7 estimated rainy day fund back up to the 228.754 is what you all passed back in April. The Senate, their beginning balance was about 23.994, after offsetting the difference in the general fund. Revenues about $3.261 billion for a general and education trust fund. So again, another about $100 million of total revenue on top of the House. Total appropriations came in at about $3.216 billion, leaving a cumulative ending balance of $69.129 million. Now, almost 20 million of that cumulative ending balance was the Education Trust Fund. So 49.9, anything remaining in the general fund by statute goes into the rainy day fund. So 49.9 million transferred into the rainy day fund under the Senate proposal, bringing the rainy day fund back to 249 million from the Senate's estimate of 25 of 199. So the two numbers of surpluses you can see is the 19 remaining in the Education Trust Fund compared to 0 in the House proposal, and then the 249 in the rainy day fund as compared to the House's 228.754. As we move on to page 2, the type gets smaller. It will give you kind of a sense of where the governor was, the House and the Senate by General and Education Trust Fund. You can see, and I'll just kind of go over kind of the large numbers, is that in 25 for general fund, House had about $1.819 billion in general fund revenues compared to the Senate's 1.847, so almost $30 million general fund revenue pickup. Schedule 2 adjustments, you can see on the small line 10, is the House had 217.954 versus 231.390 in the Senate. So those were additional appropriations. And now the additional appropriations in the Senate plan were because of 3 main factors: an additional $4.5 million settlement for a YDC victim that happened after the Senate had passed their budget, and then an additional $2.2 million for 2 other cases that the AG settled relative to HHS issues that directly come out of the general fund. So that was one of the big reasons for the increases there. The lapse estimate, as I said, increased 111 in the Senate versus 70 for the House. Almost 40 of that is related, 38 of that is related to HHS. The other couple million we'll get to, and that's based on discussions the Senate had with various agencies of lapsing, instead of non-lapsing dollars that were appropriated for 25, the Senate Finance Committee made an agreement with the agencies that if they lapse those funds in 25 to minimize the draw on the rainy day fund, they then appropriate those funds for those programs in 26 and 27. So that's the variance on the lapse. And again, the transfer to the rainy day fund, same 148.8 to the House, 93.4 from the rainy day fund in the Senate. Going into 26, if we look at the total revenues, you can see the big changes. We went over the base, but the Schedule 2 adjustments, you can see the House adjustments in revenues. These are non-current law changes relative to video lottery terminals. The large one in the House was relative to the business tax, real estate transfer tax, and tobacco tax split at a 70-30 percentage between the General and Education Trust Fund, compared to 121.3 in the Senate. And I'll get to Schedule 2 to show you where those big variances are. One of the big changes is instead of 70-30, the splits, that the Senate went with 64.5 and 35.5 splits. But then also the Senate was able to pick up some money from their proposal on video lottery terminals with funds going into the general fund. For appropriations, not a lot of off-budget spending in either the House. The House is actually negative $13.3 million in appropriations adjustments. Total budget appropriations, not significant differences between the House and the Senate in 26. You had about $1.944 billion in the House, $1.946 billion in the Senate, but you did have your Schedule 2 adjustments. A positive number is showing you offsets to any appropriations, so budget reductions. So the Senate had budget reductions totaling $13.3 million compared to the Senate having additional appropriations of about $2.4 million. Lapses changed based on percentages, keeping the 2% that the governor assumed. The lapse in 26 estimated at $38.6 million in the House based on the calculations of their total appropriations and adjustments versus $39 million in the Senate. Still at the 2% level, rounded up to $39 million. So you can see the ending balances in the general fund, 13.7 positive balance in the House compared to a negative 19.5 in the Senate. Both of those balances carry forward and then are trued up at the end of 27. Your appropriations, or your revenues at 1747.8 for the House versus 1843.9 in general funds for the Senate. That's your base revenues, current law, and then offset by the adjustments. $217.2 million of adjustments in the House to the general fund, mainly because of the revenue tax splits, and the Senate at about 138.5, so almost an $80 million difference on the general fund on that side. You can see the appropriations, 1,979,931 in the House versus 1,992,406 in the Senate for general fund appropriations. And if you look at those lines, a $13 million increase, most of that increase was due to putting in House Bill 1, Section 1, the main part of the budget, the travel and tourism money that the House had added on the floor. For the House budget, $55 million in appropriation reductions in Schedule 2 versus $19 million in appropriation reductions in the Senate. Lapse, again, using the same percentages used by the governor. House had $57.7 million versus $60 million from the Senate. Still in the 3%, but just based on their total appropriations. You can see, if we go down to the cumulative ending balance, the House at 111.7 versus the Senate at 49.9. Now that was prior to, in the House, there was a required transfer of about $26.6 million to the Education Trust Fund to bring that to zero versus nothing in the Senate, because the Senate's leaving on their proposal leaves it with a positive balance. Cumulative ending balances, you can see the $85 million in the House versus the 49.9 in the Senate. Those are then transferred on row 23 into the rainy day fund to get you to the 228.7 and $249 million in the estimated rainy day fund balance. I'm going to skip page 2, but if you're looking for base revenue, what the Ways and Means Committee of the House and the Senate on how they compare, you can see that on page 3. I apologize. But I'm going to skip to page 4, which is where all the detail is. This is called Schedule 2 of the surplus statement. So for the general fund, I'm going to highlight not all of these, but a lot of the changes that the Senate made in the policy in House Bill 1 or 2 that impact your Schedule 2 adjustments. For revenue, one of the first changes was that the Senate did add a couple of positions for additional out-of-state, multi-state auditors in DRA, and so there isn't a pickup of revenue. Looks about $2.8 million over the biennium in general funds as a result of those auditors. There's also a liquor back of the budget reduction that ends up resulting in increases in net liquor revenue to the general fund. We go to DAS on row 5, the Lakes Region Facility to State proceeds to the general fund. If you remember in the House phase in 27, the House allowed any proceeds from the sale of the Lakes Region Facility to be deposited into the general fund. What the Senate decided to do was to maintain that those $9.75 million to be used towards renovations or purchase of Granite Place. So you can see there's no additional general fund pickup versus what the House had assumed. Also, the P card revenue, this is procurement card revenue in DAS relative to the dedicated fund exercise that the House went to. DAS Admin Services had come in and offered to lapse the balance in the P card fund, the procurement card fund, of about $1.2 million, and then going forward to lapse any balance in that fund, as opposed to keeping it in a dedicated fund to allow that to build. Dedicated fund lapse, there's no change in the $16 million in a year estimated between the House and the Senate. But as the conferees get into committee of conference, they'll see how the Senate went about it is different than how the House had proposed. As you remember, the House proposed a 5% assessment with exemptions on dedicated funds. How the Senate drafted their section was to allow the governor to determine through either lapses from the funds to shifting appropriations to other revenues or other manner to get that 16 million, to leave that to the executive branch to work with the agencies to come up which funds that they could actually assume those dollars from. So no change in the dollars, change in the process to get there. Next three lines, 8, 9, and 10, are the business tax, tobacco tax, and real estate tax splits, we call them. So which portions are dedicated to the general fund versus the education trust fund. So that's where you'll see a majority of your differences between the House and the Senate on those lines. Business taxes alone, House had assumed about $116.6 million of general fund revenue coming over from the education trust fund based on their 70-30 split versus almost $62 million in the Senate based on their 64.5, 35.5 split. Moving out to 27, the House had assumed about $121.2 million in the general fund from their split, and the Senate at about 67.9. Smaller amounts but similar for the tobacco tax and real estate transfer. You see the variances based on the percentages. Real estate transfer, you actually see a decrease in revenue in the Senate proposal because they're putting less into the general fund that current law asks, but keeping the percentages amongst those three taxes at the same, just to provide administrative ease for Department of Revenue Administration. BTLA, so Treasury Meal and Rooms Distribution cap. But if I go up one more that I skipped is tax amnesty. So tax amnesty program is a program that the state usually offers every several years. So what it does is it allows taxpayers to pay their back taxes without the significant penalties that they've accrued. So this year, DRA, the commissioner, had assumed there could be some tax amnesty for individuals relative to the taxes that between the two funds is about $5 million. So 3.35 is in the general fund, and you'll see the balance in the education trust fund. Meals and Rooms distribution cap. You remember that the House capped the Meals and Rooms distribution at $137 million a year. The Senate removed that cap. So based on the revenue that comes from Meals and Rooms distribution, cities and towns will be entitled to receive that. And you'll see that in the House Bill 1 compare report that we have, as well as the detailed change that's coming up in here. Treasury unique revenue to the general fund. The House, you'll remember, had provided UNH with $15 million a year of unique revenue in other funds in House Bill 1 to provide them with financial assistance. The Senate did not go with that. What the Senate did is it lapsed $6 million in each year of the biennium will go into the general fund from the unique program, and that was after discussions with the treasurer and the board of the unique funds to ensure that the program was not impacted. So what you'll see is that the unique funds instead were deposited into the general fund of about $12 million over the biennium, and then when we get to the university system in New Hampshire, you can see the Senate did provide additional general fund support, partially offset by some of this $12 million. Increases in BTLA general fund of about $60,000 a year. We have renewable energy fund net proceeds. The House had assumed about $5 million a year of net proceeds. The Senate had amended that statute to require certain programs to continue to be funded, which ended up reducing that revenue by about $1 million a year when compared to the House. Granite Patron of the Arts tax credit is a new proposal provided by the Senate, and what that will allow is businesses to take tax deductions for any donations they make to the arts, up to about an aggregate of $350,000 a year in total across the state. So that's a negative revenue adjustments of about $700,000 over the biennium. No change in agriculture. The DHHS, if you look on lines 19 and 20, the liquor repeal, this is how both of these lines have to do with the dedication of liquor revenue. Current law dedicates portions of liquor revenue for the Alcohol Abuse Prevention and Treatment Fund that's used for the Governor's Commission on Alcohol Abuse Prevention and Treatment. What the House decided to do was to deposit all liquor revenue to the general fund and then make a decision on how to fund the Governor's Commission in House Bill 1. The Senate reversed that decision and will maintain that dedication is proposing to maintain that dedication in liquor revenues. Same for the Granite Advantage program. The House had proposed to put all liquor revenue into the general fund and then provide the necessary general fund appropriations for the remainder cost of the Granite Advantage program. The Senate reversed that decision, will maintain the dedication of the liquor revenue to that program. So there's no net change in that decision between the House and the Senate, because this revenue, you'll see, will be offset by removal of appropriation of an equal amount down low under the appropriations. Row 24, the Senate added a nursing home bed fee to the general fund, just shifting that money to the general fund. That's about $300,000 a year to offset some of the other adds that the Senate provided to HHS. HHS Granted Advantage premium decrease. These are the Medicaid, the premiums, the Medicaid copays. The Senate had changed from what both the governor and House proposed. The Senate had changed it to a per family set amount, which you'll see in House Bill 2. That ended up costing the Senate about $7 million in premium revenue from the House and the governor proposals. So you can see that accounted for on row 25. If we look at motor vehicle inspection repeal, as you've read, the House and the Senate differ right now in House Bill 2 on how they propose to change motor vehicle inspections. The House had a negative 150,000 and 300,000 in the 2 years for the general fund. You'll see most of this reduction in the highway fund, and versus the Senate and what they propose is about a net $5,000 change to revenues. Video lottery terminals general fund share. For the, as previously stated, the House had recommended all lottery revenue, including video lottery revenue, to go into fund adequacy as a restricted revenue. The Senate proposal is different in the tax that is assessed against the VLT owners. Instead of 30% in the House, it's 31.25% in the Senate. But how that revenue is distributed is different between the House and the Senate. House basically had it all going towards adequate education, and you can see for the next 2 years, the Senate proposes to put a portion into the general fund, estimated at about $23.78 million in 26 and $38 million in 27, and put a portion into the smaller portion into the education trust fund. And then in out years 28 and forward, it's the Senate creates a new fund for the elderly, blind, and disabled tax exemption reimbursement program. But that was something that was in the Senate VLT bill that they passed over to the House, but the Senate decided to delay that implementation of that fund for 2 years. If we go to, so the total revenue adjustments in the House, a positive $190.25 million for the general fund in 26, $217.3 million in 27. For the Senate, positive revenue adjustments, $121.3 in 26 and $138.585 in 27. For appropriation adjustments, you'll see not many in 25 until we get to the next page. House, Senate, and Governor estimate appropriations at $151.5 million. That's what has passed in previous legislature. 2024 session bills, what had passed last session, $45 million. And then statutory, fiscal, and GNC estimate. These changed when the governor came out with her budget in February. She had estimated $29.1 million in off-budget general fund appropriations. Since that time, both through fiscal and activity outside in the executive branch with open warrant authority, the House had bumped that number up by $13 million to $42.494. The Senate had to add an additional 13 on top of that based on additional settlements and additional fiscal committee requests to bring that number to about $55.8 million. So that's 25. When we go through the other appropriation adjustments, we have row 36 is a bill that at the time the House had the budget had a cost of about $80,000 a year, so the House correctly accounted for that. That budget or that bill was changed to include a dollar appropriation from the Senate, so that's why you'll see a removal of that $80,000 cost. Row 41, judicial branch budget reduction removed by the Senate. It was about $7.8 million over the biennium for in the House proposal versus zero in the Senate proposal. In addition, you'll see some adds back to the judicial branch budget when we get to House Bill 1 coming up. Justice budget reduction also removed. That was about $7.9 million in 26. The House had proposed with the back of the budget, and $6.8 million back of the budget in 27. So the Senate had removed both of those. You remember there was a previously federally funded program that the governor provided general funds for. That was the reason, about $7 million a year. That's one of the reasons the House back of the budget reduction was so high. Human Rights Commission budget reduction. This is new. How the House and Senate and how they decided to fund the Human Rights Commission varies, and we'll see that coming up. The Senate also added a back of the budget reduction of almost $500,000 over the biennium. Corrections budget reduction. There are numerous changes in the corrections budget, which you'll see in the upcoming pages. On top of that, the Senate decided to add a $5 million back of the budget reduction over the biennium for corrections. HHS budget reduction. The House had $23 million a year. The Senate increased that to $25.5 million a year. And then if we go down towards the bottom, some House Bill 2 changes. Appropriations for the Commission on Aging of about $150,000 a year. Implementation costs for tax amnesty of $50,000 in general funds. And then moving on to page 5, you'll see the majority of those changes. Just go over kind of just quickly on 25. Cannon Mountain, the lapse of the tramway appropriation on 62 remains the same between the House and the Senate. There was a change in the Prescription Drug Affordability Board carry forward of FY25 amounts on row 67 of about $20,000. No change to the Farmers Market program in 25. And then you can see down on row 84, Hampstead Hospital transition. This was a Senate bill that was added into House Bill 2 with an appropriation of $160,000 relative to work that's going around in Hampstead Hospital. And that's all for 25. No difference in the computer science appropriation lapse versus the House and the Senate. When we get into 26 and 27 and 26, the Group 2 retirement change, that's one of the $13 million difference. The House had appropriated $27.5 million a year. The Senate delayed the implementation of that group retirement change and then took $13 million savings. So you can see their 27.5 coming down to the 14.5. For the YDC Claims Settlement Fund, both the House and the Senate provide $20 million over the biennium for the YDC Claims Settlement Fund. House provides that with $10 million each fiscal year. As a non-lapsing fund, the Senate decided to provide all that funding up front, so $20 million in 26. What you won't see in here, and you'll see later, is an additional deposit into the YDC settlement fund could come from the sale of the current Sununu Youth Services Center in Manchester. There's been various discussions. There's a separate House Bill 2 section that keeps it off the general fund, so any sale proceeds will go directly into the YDC settlement fund. Most likely the sale of that that property would not occur until 27. So on top of the $20 million in general funds, there's also an assumed $80 million in the Senate proposal of other funds going in there. You have changes to labor first responders critical injury benefit on row 56. It was an increase of about $125,000 a year, $250 over the biennium for those individuals who are eligible for that benefit. An appropriation on row 60 for the Ireland Trade Council under Business and Economic Affairs of $20,000. You have row 62, Safety Rural Maternal Health, EMS Services, a new appropriation of about $75 million a year. Also, row 63, the Northern Border Allowance, the Senate did propose a general fund appropriation of $600,000 for the Northern Border Alliance. This was something that was not in the governor or the House budget, although it was discussed throughout the whole process. The next is Pillsbury Lake Village District, some assistance of $325,000 in general funds for 3 programs or projects that they're undergoing over there. And then environmental services state aid grants, in addition to anything appropriated in House Bill 1, an additional $2.5 million, hoping to provide new projects to be eligible for those funds. For row 67, you have HHS, you have a carry forward of PDAB, which is no longer there, which we talked about. A granted advantage appropriation. You remember we talked about liquor revenue being restricted in the Senate plan. Because it wasn't restricted in the House plan and it went into the general fund, there was a requirement to appropriate almost 13.6 over the biennium in general funds. The Senate was able to remove those general funds, but also took the hit in revenue up on the revenue adjustments. So no net change between those two positions in the House and Senate. The Senate maintains the current funding arrangement with relative to Medicaid advantage, granted advantage. HHS WIC Farmers Market Program, the Senate provided $15,000 a year in additional funding for the WIC Farmers Market Program. Medicaid provider rate reduction. The House had almost $52.5 million of a provider rate reduction for 3%. That was one of the first actions that the Senate Finance Committee took, is to remove that reduction. They were able to do that based on their revenue estimates at the time and based on their discussions they had after their public hearing on House Bill 1 and 2 in front of the Senate. That became one of their top priorities. If we look at HHS on row 72, congregate housing, about $350,000 a year. 73 is HHS, a developmental services pilot program of about $1 million over the biennium. HHS under row 74, additional appropriation of $450,000 in 26, $150,000 in 27 for adverse childhood. On row 75, summer EBT program, about 70, if I can read across the line, that's $105,000 over the biennium of additional general funds for that program. Row 76 is ICF, that's the Intermediate Care Facility, a rate increase provided to those facilities who have a very unique population provided under Medicaid. So that's about $70,000 in 25, $142,000 in 27, 26 and 27. Independent birth centers, row 77, receives an appropriation of $30,000 under the Senate proposal. Community residential services, acquired brain disorders, that's $5 million a year of general fund appropriation, so $10 million over the biennium for community residential services for that population. You have rural residency training under HHS under row 79 of $500,000. You have a Tier 1 call center on row 80, which is almost $3.8 million over the biennium for a Tier 1 call center at HHS of general funds. Row 81, the Child Care Scholarship Pilot Program of $100,000 to get a pilot program at least started to see what the state can do relative to offering child care scholarships and the various sources of funds. Row 82 is the guardianship contracted services, about $275,000 a year of general funds of support. And then you have a Medicaid on row 83, Medicaid long-term care eligibility determinations of about $1.5 million a year to help with the backlog of eligibility determinations that is currently occurring under the nursing homes. And then if we go down to row 87, facility improvement funds that were added, $460,000 for education for that purpose. So in total of Schedule 2 adjustment appropriations, in 26, the House had a positive or a reduction of appropriations of 13.3 compared with an additional appropriation of 2.4 million in the Senate proposal after taking into account the changes in back of the budget reductions. In 27, the House Schedule 2 reduces general fund appropriations by $55 million compared to $19 million in the Senate proposal. So almost a $30 million, what is that? We got about a $35 million swing, majority of that going into the provider rate increase, removal of that reduction. And then moving on to page 6, this is the Education Trust Fund. So one of the last decisions that both the House and the Senate made were relative to the tax splits. Because the business tax revenue, lottery, tobacco tax revenue, and real estate revenue are split between the two funds, in the House phase, this was one of the last decisions the House made because they had to make sure that everything balanced. And they came up with splits of 70-30 to fund their proposal relative to the Education Trust Fund. Senate changed that to 64.5 and 35.5, not only to maintain balancing of the Education Trust Fund, but to also leave it with a balance of 19.18 million at the end of the biennium. So if we go through 25 real quick, the estimated revenues on row 4, we can see the Senate at about 1233.6. I would compare that to the 199.9. The $10 million adjustment in the Schedule 4 under 25 has to do with additional lottery revenue estimates that came in after additional Ways and Means discussions. So that's about a $33 million additional revenue in the Education Trust Fund. No change in total appropriations between the House and Senate proposal or estimate in 25. Current year balance is changing because of the differences in revenues. So you have a $71.8 million positive balance in the House proposal versus $105.5 million. Again, all having to do with the revenue in 25. Beginning in estimated revenues, the base revenues, House 1193.8 versus 1276.7, so almost $80 million plus of additional revenues in the Education Trust Fund just on the base revenue estimates. Schedule 4 adjustments, you'll see big differences between the House and the Senate, because you will remember the House dedicating all their lottery revenue that used to be deposited as unrestricted Education Trust Fund to restrict that revenue under adequacy. So a negative $307.3 million versus a negative $47.8 million House versus Senate, which are two reasons: the lottery revenue, but also your splits that we talked about before. For comparative purposes, we added a new line for lottery revenue restricted for adequacy of 255.223, just so you can see in total like an apples to apples comparison between the Governor, House, and Senate on the funds provided towards education. So in total revenue, 1.141 under the House proposal versus 1.228 in the Senate proposal in the Education Trust Fund. We go down to 26, continue down the appropriations. I'm going to go to the row 14, total appropriations about 1198.9. That includes what the House appropriated under the Education Trust Fund, also restricted under lottery revenue, versus 1290.87, which is the total revenue provided to adequacy and the various other costs. There were probably about 80, and we'll get to the details, I think it was almost $80 million a year in one general fund appropriations that the House had that the Senate moved back over to the Education Trust Fund based on those splits and based on their decisions there. In the end, the cumulative ending balance in 26 under the House proposal, 14.6 versus 43.6 in the Senate proposal. Both those balances carry forward into 27. It's a non-lapsing fund. For the House, add an additional revenue, we'll see in total revenue, including adjustments of about 1.192 versus in the Senate 1.279. Most of that because of the splits and the estimates on your video lottery terminal. Total appropriations in the Education Trust Fund, you have 1233.4 in the House plan, including the lottery, versus 1303 in the Senate plan. Again, the majority of that difference isn't in your adequacy line. It's for moving things that used to be funded on the Education Trust Fund back to the Education Trust Fund. The House had swapped those, but we'll get to that into the detailed change. Current year balance in the House proposal, $41.3 million in the negative. That offset by the 14.6 that came forward, required a general fund transfer of 26.659 just to bring the balance to zero at the end of the biennium as is required by law. As far as the Senate proposal, they have a negative 24.391 current balance, which eats into the 43.5 that came forward, the balance forward, but provides a remaining balance of 19.2 million at the end of the biennium. If we go into, I'm going to skip to page 8 right now, and this has to do with the Education Trust Fund share of those various changes that the Senate's proposing relative to the multi-state auditor positions. There's a couple $1 million in Education Trust Fund revenue associated with that. Video lottery terminals, you can see over the biennium almost $20 million of Education Trust Fund revenue from video lottery terminal proposal in the Senate. The lottery maximum ticket price of $50 estimated to raise looks like almost $1 million. That's in 27. Changes in Keno hours of operations, that's a few $1 million over the biennium for that. Local option for games of chance in Keno has an increase of $500,000 in 27 based on the Senate proposal, which you'll see in the detail in House Bill 2. We have the tax amnesty program, $5 million overall, 1.6 came from, or will go into the Education Trust Fund. You remember the 3.3 on Schedule 2 to the general fund. And then the tax splits under the revenue adjustments. These are the corresponding reductions, the Education Trust Fund, that match dollar for dollar with what we went over on the general fund Schedule 2. For appropriation adjustments, one of the big changes between the House and the Senate was on row 20. That has to do with the excess swept based on a bill that had passed the House at the time. There was revenue of $27 million of additional revenue coming into the Education Trust Fund from donor towns. That bill has died, and so the Senate could not count on any of the excess donor town revenues. There's also, I won't get into the details, but the Rand decision came out today. That was the court case challenging the constitutionality of statewide property tax, statewide education property tax. I talked to a lawyer, but in general there'll be a minimal impact on that relative to unincorporated towns, but more of a process change on DRA. So nothing you have to worry too much from a budget perspective relative to that decision that came out today. The Keno local option has been moved up. That was on adequacy grants down low. DOA learning program, $1.5 million of Education Trust Fund appropriations each year, and then DOE adult education, an additional $400,000 in Education Trust Fund support for adult education. And I'll move rather quickly through the next two on the highway fund, just really based on decisions on page 9. If you compare the Governor, House, and Senate proposal, most of the changes are coming from the decisions that you're all going to make relative to motor vehicle fees, but also the motor vehicle inspections. So there is various proposals there between the House and the Senate. In the end, at the end of 27, the Governor's proposal had the cumulative ending balance of 0 versus the House of $13 million positive balance in the highway fund. The Senate, based on their changes to the highway fund revenues, about $3.75 million of a positive balance in the highway fund. We turn to page 10 is the Fish and Game comparative statement of undesignated surplus. Again, most of the changes happened in House Bill 2. You remember the House had proposed transferring funds from dedicated accounts of about $1.3 million in 25 to bring the balance of the Fish and Game Fund up. The Senate removed that. And so in the end, the House had proposed about appropriations and revenues resulting in a positive balance of about $3.1 million in the Fish and Game Fund at the end of 27. That number comes down to about $600,000 in the Senate proposal. So on page 11 and forward, I won't go through line by line all of these. Feel free to come down to our office in the State House and ask myself or any of our analysts questions on these changes. I'm going to try to jump around and go through some of the big ones. The legislative branch, no change between the House and the Senate. Same for the executive department. Couple positions restored under the Governor's Commission on Disability, split funding, general and other. DOIT changes, when you look at those rows, are really relative to decisions made on the Housing Appeals Board, Human Rights, Child Advocate, Board and Tax and Land Appeals, decisions that the Senate made versus what the House had. There were some reductions under administrative services that were offered to Senate Finance based on swapping positions, but also reducing transfers relative to maintenance services provided by admin services. Housing Appeals Board moved from Department of Administrative Services to the Board of Tax and Land Appeals. When we have a compare report in House Bill 1. We're also working on a current side-by-side on House Bill 2 of the various sections that will help the conferees go through that. Conservation Land Stewardship Program is more just moved from DAS, Admin Services, to Fish and Game Department, so that's why there's a reduction there. Advocate of Special Education, some small changes on reallocation of funds. On page 12, one of the bigger changes the Senate made relative to policy is relative to the Office of Child Advocate. The House, as you remember, eliminated the Office of Child Advocate. The Senate restored it partially. Not fully, but did restore about 1.5, almost $1.6 million in general funds over the biennium. So small changes under the Department of State. On row 41, under DRA, we mentioned the additional auditors, the 2 multi-state auditors. The total cost of those positions are about $465,000, but more than offset by the additional revenue on Schedule 2 and 4. Treasury Department, the other funds, you'll see an additional $11.2 million. That's from removing the cap of $137 million set by the House on the Meals and Rooms distribution. You can see the Senate adding back the College Savings Commission funds. That was a reduction the House did. The House had $15 million a year. The Senate put that to $6 million a year because they dedicated $6 million to the general fund. But that has to do with unique. So that those funds are restored. Board of Tax and Land Appeals. The House restored the Board of Tax and Land Appeals in House Bill 2 on the floor. They did not provide the funding. So this provides some funding to the Board of Tax and Land Appeals. In total, just between those two, almost $2 million over the biennium between other and general funds. Housing Appeal Board is being proposed to be restored by the Senate versus the elimination under the House proposal. No impact, but New Hampshire Retirement System did have a back of the budget reduction of other funds of about 4.2 and 4.4 million in 26 and 27, which was removed by the Senate. No changes to Developmental Disabilities Council or Executive Council. On page 14, under the Judicial Branch, we mentioned earlier today the removal of the back end budget reduction of about $7.8 million on the Judicial Branch. These are additions and changes that were made to the Judicial Branch. There was a reduction of $286,000 in general funds provided to the Judicial Branch based on the Department of Administrative Services maintenance agreement with them that was shown on the previous page under DAS as other funds. But they also received $554.9 million to restore Goffstown and Hooksett courthouses based on the House and Governor proposal. Those are 2 courthouses that were going to close. The Senate also increases funding for additional resources in Superior Court for YDC's claims cases of almost $877,000. Although it's a YDC claim settlement fund, there is also, those cases are simultaneously filed in the Superior Court, and so the litigant makes a decision later on in the process, but there is thousands of claims that are going into the Superior Court relative to YDC claims. Court security, increased funding for court security officer per diem training days of about $200,000 over the biennium, and increased funding for sheriff reimbursements of about $2.25 million, which was a request made of the Senate. Human Rights Commission restored approximately $3.5 million over the biennium, 3.2 of that being general funds. No changes to the banking department in House Bill 1. The Office of State and Public Labor Relations, there are various changes made here relative to Public Employer Labor Relations Board, relative to GYT transfers and licensing for Microsoft and various other allocations. On page 15, Insurance Department, one additional position of other funds of $189,400 over the biennium. On the Liquor Commission, you can see the restoration of the elimination of liquor enforcement. So there is a House Bill 1 component of that of about $6.2 million over the biennium. You remember in Schedule 2 under the General Fund, the Senate took that adjustment because they did not eliminate enforcement. They did not take any savings relative to or any additional revenue relative to net profit. Department of Energy unfunded position of $265,000 of other funds. Under the Department of Safety, a couple changes with some federal funds and allocation between class lines, but under the communication sections or communication sections, it was the use of E911 funds. The Senate using about $2.9 million in E911 funds that allowed them to reduce general funds for that purpose of $2.9 million. So they offset each other to zero, but the general fund benefit of about $2.9 million. Positions were moved between the Road Toll Bureau and the International Registration Program. There was some funding restored for commercial enforcement relative to passenger motor vehicle inspections. So depending on where the conferees end up on where they agree on motor vehicle inspections, there will be adjustments in House Bill 1 to reflect it, which you'll see here. Under the Department of Corrections, probably one of the largest changes in detail was made with the House. You remember the House had proposed elimination and reduction in various positions throughout the department. The Senate has their own proposal on how they'll reduce some of that funding. They restored funding to the Department of Corrections, but where they restored it and in what positions, you'll see that in the detail. I won't go over every one, but it's basically page 15 through 16 are all the various changes. Even continuing into page 17, all the various changes on corrections, the money added back, as well as where the Senate wanted to take their reductions and corrections. So from a committee of conference standpoint in House Bill 1, one of the most detailed, difficult discussions in House Bill 1 will be relative to what the conferees agree to on corrections and how to fund them. House Bill 1 section, we previously mentioned the Senate included a $5 million back of the budget reduction. So they did restore almost half of the $37 million roughly that the House had cut, but they did reduce that by $5 million on top. Judicial Council, Contract Council received $200,000 for involuntary mental health admission hearings. And then on page 18, additional $3.8 million provided for the Public Defender Program based on what they were getting back relative to contract costs. Page 19 is Department of Business and Economic Affairs, safety rest areas. No difference between what the House passed budget, because you remember in the House passed budget there was a floor amendment to add back safety rest areas. The Senate removed that section in House Bill 2, instead provided that funding of $2.25 million into House Bill 1, as well as other funds of about $77,000. Same to be said with the $14 million on row 7 tourism development. You remember the House had a floor amendment to add back the $14 million for tourism development fund. The Senate removed the section from House Bill 2 and funded it in House Bill 1. So a net no change positions relative to the House and Senate proposal. Some positions, federal funds were funded relative to planning admin, and then Department of Natural and Cultural Resources relative to state arts development. We previously mentioned the grant, the tax credit that the Senate provided. I think about $350,000 a year to allow individuals and businesses to donate and then receive a tax credit. In addition, They did restore some of the reductions in funding to state arts, $300,000 in federal funds on row 12, but then on row 14 and 15, in total, almost $2 million of additional funding for the Federal Arts Partnership Grant, which includes $1.7 million in federal funds and $300 in general fund match. And then Federal Preservation Program for a position with interagency transfers of about 184.8, and that's other funds. We had some movement in Department of Environmental Services relative to where positions are funded between Class 10 and 59. On page 20, we previously showed a reduction under admin services. You can see an increase of $561,000. This has to do with the Conservation Land Stewardship Program being moved from the administrative services to Fish and Game under the Senate proposal. No general fund cost. On page 21 is your transportation. Moving of funds, you can see the first two lines are really just movement on various class lines relative to the department's intentions incentive program. And you have the Highway Maintenance Bureau on row 4 receiving $250,000 for additional salary and benefits for positions relative to Senate Bill 153. It has to do with the expedited driveway permitting program because the Senate assumed passage of that bill. They also included the highway funds in order to administer that program. And then apportionment A and B is the aid to the block grant aid to cities and towns based on highway revenue in the previous year. So based on the changes to the revenue estimates that the Senate has, there's a corresponding adjustment in House Bill 1. Again, something that in the House Bill 1 Committee Conference we'll make sure we go through and true up these funds depending on where both the House and Senate end up on revenues to the highway fund. Page 22 is HHS. Row 2, Child and Family Services, and moving funding between fiscal year for youth residential placement, but no net change over the biennium. Federal funds for child care programs were removed from House Bill 1 and instead put into House Bill 2. So between the two bills, no net change. It's just where the location on where they were funded. HHS Medicaid Services, under, if you look on rows 8 and 9, this has to do with the agreement in the hospitals relative to the MET, the Medicaid Enhancement Tax lawsuit, that at the time the House had passed the budget, there was no resolution on that issue. Based on the resolution on the MET tax that the governor and the hospitals has agreed on, or had agreed on, there was a change in where the funds were budgeted between provider payments and under uncompensated care, under Medicaid care management as well. So based on the agreement, just a quick summary is really to put more of the uncompensated care payments into directed payments to the hospitals, still using the same amount of revenue, just putting it in, reimbursing hospitals in a different manner, instead of trying to change the formula on uncompensated care, which is a little harder to direct those funds. Medicaid care management, there's a removing of savings on 12 and 13 relative to the circumcision bill that did not pass the Senate. Row 16, Alzheimer's and related disorders, about $200,000 over the biennium for respite caregiver grant program. Senate had restored funds for the family planning program of $1 million over the biennium in general funds and almost $2 million in federal funds for those programs. Some small changes under community collaboration, a placeholder for tobacco prevention and cessation, and then moving on to 23. We have under behavioral health, the Senate was asked to add back $150,000 or add $150,000 a year for the Choose Love program. And then under the Governor's Commission, this is the Alcohol Abuse Prevention Fund. It's being budgeted again in as restricted liquor revenue in House Bill 1. The House had proposed using opioid abatement trust funds. You can see that on row 10, which the Senate removed because they're going to maintain the current funding mechanism. System of care, $400,000 for Friends of Annie peer-to-peer grief support. Community mental health program, one of the three, for the first three decisions made by Senate Finance Committee was to add $37.8 million in additional general funds for community mental health program that the House had to reduce from the governor's budget based on their revenue estimates. And then the third below, the third priority of the Senate based on their public hearing was adding funding back to developmental services. Because of where they saw revenue come in, the Senate Finance Committee added back about $31.4 million roughly in general funds on top of an additional 31.4 in federal match. And this is to fully fund the developmental services waitlist at the governor's level. Rows 44 and below are requested accounting adjustments. I probably bored you enough. I won't go through these ones. These are just a true up when the budget's actually passed. It allows the executive office to effectuate these changes. But a lot of this federal funds, no net general fund impacts. Same with rows 57, position movements, same number of positions, just where they are budgeted. And then the detailed change on page 25 is your category 6, your education. On row 11 is additional funds provided, actually additional and reductions provided by the Senate Finance Committee when comparing their proposal on EFAs at the time the House had it versus where the Senate's EFA proposal was through the process. Based on the Senate's estimates, they were able to reduce the EFA amounts based on the final language of about $3.9 million over the biennium. There were other movements. You can see a lot of from 1 to 10 are moving. They're reductions of funds, and what these are doing is moving public school infrastructure funding back to the Education Trust Fund on row 3, moving state assessment and accountability back from the general fund back to the Education Trust Fund. So these are variances between the House and the Senate. Same with court-ordered placements of about $9 million over the biennium. School building aid being one of the larger ones you can see on row 13 and 14. That's a source of fund change. Both House and Senate funded at the same level. The House funded with general funds. The Senate is proposing to fund it, continue to fund that with Education Trust Fund. Same on building aid lease, just a source of fund change. And then adequate education change. The big change of the $546 million is the unrestricting of the lottery revenue just for adequacy aid, and instead maintaining those funds be deposited into the Education Trust Fund and appropriated here. No change relative to that, just the source of funds. And then on row 19 is a change in adequate education aid. You'll remember the House provided an additional $27.4 million of additional adequate education aid to reflect changes to adequacy grants in House Bill 2. The Senate removed those changes in House Bill 2 and as a result removed the $27 million of additional. This decision, as long as in coordination with the decision the Senate made on donor towns, made in correlation. Special education aid, again, just a movement in the source of funds, almost $100 million. This House funded with general funds. The Senate funds it with Education Trust Fund. So that's another thing the conferees are going to go over on both House Bill 1 and 2, and which programs they would like to fund from the general fund as well as the Education Trust Fund. They're agreeing on the amounts in most of these between the House and the Senate. It's just the source of funds for those. Same with tuition and transportation, court-ordered placements, etc. On 26, on the next page, we have Council for Responsible Gaming, eliminating funding for that because there's a big change under the Senate's proposal on video lottery terminals. In House Bill 2, there's also a change relative to creating I believe it's a council on addiction, all types of addiction, including gambling, alcohol, and drug, and funding that with proceeds from VLT is about $600,000 a year. So to combine those two into one instead of having all these standalone committees was the Senate's decision. Community College System New Hampshire received an additional $1 million for a dual and concurrent amendment, and then also a change to the language in House Bill 2 relative to that program. One of the larger changes, we'll work on the formatting on my end, is University System New Hampshire. The Senate added $67.5 million in general funds over what the House had proposed, offset by a reduction in those unique funds of $30 million. So in total funding, between other funds and general funds, the House and Senate vary about 37 million, but vary 67 million on the source of those funds, on the general funds. And then just kind of wrapping up on page 27, other changes, selected changes to the House budget. These aren't all the changes. There are House Bill 2 coming out of the Senate. There's over 560 sections. The House had almost 450 sections in House Bill 2. So there are multiple changes between House Bill 2. A lot of those get picked up in the detailed change and also get picked up on the surplus statement as Schedule 2. There are some that don't have a monetary impact necessarily that will get picked up in the General and Education Trust Fund, monetary to those two funds. Legislative branch added a section relative to parking and office space assignment. Judicial branch amended RSA 135C relative to the Indigent Defense Fund and covering the cost of court-appointed attorneys. YDC Claims Administration and Settlement Fund, although not general fund, you can see the $80 million estimate of proceeds from the sale of the Sununu Youth Services Center. Another change that the Senate made to the YDC Claims Administration and Settlement Fund was to move the appointment of YDC Claims Administrator to the executive branch with approval of the governor and council. How the current administrator was appointed was with from the judicial branch approval. So that changes that appointment. No cost, but is a change in that policy. Department of Safety changes to deletes an increased insurance company fee for motor vehicle records, makes changes relative to motor vehicle inspections, and reduces certain motor vehicle registration fees from amounts included in the House passed budget. It's one of the reasons that the balance in the highway fund were lower in the Senate proposal versus the House. Various changes in environmental services relative to solid waste facility sites and their evaluation. That'll be one area that the House and Senate will be going over in detail in the committee conferences. Under HHS, allowing the use of general funds to support infrastructure at Sununu Youth Services Center replacement facility pending fiscal approval. On page 28, incorporates a component of Senate Bill 113 requiring HHS to seek federal approval of Medicaid benefit for supportive housing. Economic stability, it deletes a provision relative to establishing a Development Services Recreational Services Fund, which the House had proposed to fund that with charitable gaming revenue. Medicaid services, it incorporates Senate Bill 34 relative to the work requirement for the granted advantage population, revises some deadlines relative to outpatient procedure incentives under Medicaid, requires Medicaid coverage of biomarker testing, and incorporates Senate Bill 137 relative to coverage of hospital stays under the Medicaid state plan. Under public health, it modifies the House Section 380 to allow HHS to enroll new participants in the state loan repayment program. Under behavioral health, there's a change relative to co-occurring substance use and mental health disorders on who can receive funding, incorporating a modified version of Senate Bill 255 relative to the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline 988 to be funded with communication surcharge dedicated to that fund, as well as authorized 988 license plates. Under long-term supports, establishing a committee to study long-term managed care, suspends rather than repeal the foster grandparent program, and to a repeat of the developmental services change under recreational services. Office of the Commissioner, Senate does propose to repeal the Prescription Drug Affordability Board. It deletes sections relative to the definition of biological products and establishes a transition plan for the sale of the Philbrook Center, which is assumed sold in both the House and Senate proposal. There was a section the Senate put in to ensure that services to the current clients residing there are not interrupted. And then the last page of the Senate changes to the House budget, there was a provision put in by the House to allow HHS Commissioner to accept gifts for the department. $250,000 was the limit provided by the House. The Senate has changed that to $1,000 and combined those gifts to specific purposes rather than an open donation. New Hampshire Veterans Home, a small change to expanded transfer authority between class lines. And then Department of Education adds a section relative to the declaration of the legislative authority regarding public education and clarifies some sections related to the diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so this is a long briefing, but a briefing of all the changes that the Senate made to the House budget. There has been a committee or conference formed for House Bill 1 and 2, which will start later this week. And so over the next, you have about a little over a week for the House and Senate to go over their changes in both House Bill 1 and 2, to come up with agreements on where you think your revenues will be on general education and highway, to agree on appropriation. So it's a big lift that the conferees have. It's something our staff will be there to go along the way to assist both the House and Senate on decisions made in both bodies. We won't be able to give you reasons on decisions, but we'll be able to give you the detail behind those decisions. So any questions either myself or my staff can answer, or we can take? I think I bored everyone, so feel free to come to our office. We're down in State House 101 and 102. If you have any questions on specific programs that are funded in either the House or Senate budget, reach out to me or any of our staff and we can assist you. Thank you very much. Oh, sorry, I have one question, Representative Thomas.
Is this on? Okay.
Yes.
Just where is the information about taking money from the Renewable Energy Fund? I didn't see that specifically.
Yes. So on, let's see if I can find this. Page 4. So if you look on page 5, on Schedule 2, really small.
Which line are you on?
We're on line 57. Still lapses, initial $20 million lapse from Renewable Energy Fund, and then a change back that the Senate made to the House proposal. You remember on top of the $20 million that there was another $5 million a year in revenue that the House had assumed. That number was changed in the Senate down from $5 million to $4 million a year, and you'll find that on row 15 on page 4.
15 on 4. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Sure, I think I have one question, so sure. Okay. I can recognize, sure, go ahead.
Okay, from page 11 on, the detailed changes, what's the column SOF?
Sorry, so that's source of funding. And then with the source of funding, a G is general funds, F is federal funds, H, highway funds, O is other funds. That's anything from agency incomes to assessments that are specifically restricted for a purpose, et cetera.
Thank you.
Sure.
So page 3, fiscal year 25, the year we're in, right? We got 3 weeks left. There's some significant big number differences between the Senate and the House. Do all these come from DRA, or maybe this is a Chris question?
Yes, there'd be Senate Ways and Means estimates. The big change there, the $30 million, happened under your business taxes on row 1, and that was after the Senate had discussions with Commissioner Stepp. House Ways and Means had those same discussions. There was additional information that came in after House Ways and Means, but that's a number that both the House and Senate are going to have to agree to in committee or conference. But that's the largest increases under your business taxes.
Well, but there's also a 30 million less in I&D and a 24 million more in insurance.
Yes. Yes, and again, just based on discussions with DRA, their I&D revenue, they brought down by about $30 million, looking at how your April revenues came in and how May was trending. And then as far as insurance, that was with discussions with the insurance commissioner relative to that.
Okay.
Sure, yes.
Thank you. My question is, they're assuming some extra revenue from the introduction of video lottery terminals, but how is it possible to have any significant change in revenue given the fact that, at least for the users of the machines and I guess everybody but the casinos themselves, it's pretty much exactly the same thing as historic horse racing machines, which have been in place for a number of years. So how does that generate any extra revenue whatsoever? Not that I mind getting some extra revenue from the VLTs rather than the historic horse racing machines.
So both. So historical horse racing, actually, the revenue from historical horse racing in general under current law is coming in and higher than anticipated. So that's one part. As far as VLTs on top of that, there was belief in the House and Senate that in addition to the current historical horse racing that you have in the state, that video lottery terminals would be picked up by other entities on top. You could have an entity with both historical horse racing, only historical horse racing, or only VLT. So I think in the House and the Senate and the conferees will be working this out. They still thought having both will still result in additional revenue. Sure. Yes.
Hi, I have one more question. So there are recent reports that say that we have a 71 decrease in numbers of Canadians that are visiting New Hampshire. So do these numbers reflect that decrease, or is there some sort of a protection in the budget for a significant decrease in tourism?
So that would really be up to the Senate Ways and Means Committee. I was going to go back to see where they were on meals and rooms. They actually came in higher. So as the conferees, that will have to be a decision made by the conferees on House Bill 1 on whether or not they want to adjust their revenue adjustments in meals and rooms or any other taxes as a result of a potential decrease in Canadian visitors. But that would be a revenue estimate change.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Since there's a lot of questions about the estimates, I've already sent an email to Chairman Wilder about having DRA come in and brief us on those estimates. So it's not only the House Ways and Means and the Senate Ways and Means, which did change it after the Ways and Means Committee in the Senate. We will get a direct report, I hope, from the Commissioner.
Thank you. Thanks. Okay, so if there are any other questions, we can take them, but if not, again, feel free to email us, call us, or stop by our office, and we can assist you. Thank you very much.